Welcome, everyone. Just letting all the attendees in and then we'll get started. All right, welcome everyone. It's very nice to see you all today. My name is Amy Bello. For any of you that I think I know everyone here, but if I don't, my name is Amy Bello and I'm the Interim Director of International Student and Scholar Services. And with us today, we have Lana Morozova, who's our International Services Coordinator, as well as we have Bob Aronson and Deborah Schneider from Frederickson and Byron. Bob and Deborah are two immigration attorneys that we work with on most of our employment-based cases. And they are here to talk about, new developments in immigration that are going on. So I will let them take over. Thank you, Bob and Deborah.
All right, good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for attending. And thanks very much to ISSS for the invitation. And our purpose is really to expand on the initiatives of ISSS in keeping its community abreast of new immigration developments. So we hope to support them in this effort. There's obviously been, with the election, a change in at least tone and a great deal of optimism that we're going to see somewhat of a new era in U.S. immigration. And so what we want to do, and obviously it's very early in the Biden administration, but because of some enhanced, maybe inflated expectations, we thought it would be useful to kind of give an assessment of what the goals are, what's been accomplished, and what the current realities are in terms of dealing with the U.S. immigration system. So what we'd like to do is to discuss the following. I'm going to be talking about assessing the impact of the recent election. And then we'll start talking about what has transpired and what will remain on the agenda for future consideration. We're going to then switch, and Deborah's going to take over the discussion in looking at some kind of on-the-ground issues which your students and scholars are dealing with in three specific areas. The biggest one probably being international travel. I'm sure you're getting a lot of inquiries from your students and scholars about traveling. So we're going to try to take a crack at what are the current provisions, and it's obviously subject to the proviso that things are in a state of rapid change. We want to talk about the H-1B temporary worker, since that's really the entry point for your students and scholars to enter the workforce post kind of university experience. And then we'll talk somewhat about permanent residence, both about kind of the nuts and bolts, but also just what we're seeing in terms of the standards of adjudication. And then the final point is something which we've unfortunately had to get quite familiar with, which is dealing with administrative delays. Things are just so backlogged, and the bureaucracy is really having a hard time dealing with COVID and a new administration and a change of culture, and all of these things have really congealed to create some significant delays. Next slide, please. So what's going on with the Biden administration? again, I want to stress that we're literally just at the 2-month mark. But Biden, both in his campaign and carrying forward into his opening days in office, has placed a very heavy emphasis on humanitarian principles, both domestically as well as immigration. And so one of his principal foci is really to restore humanitarian values within the immigration system. Now, that mainly translates into affording protection to persecuted minorities, persecuted individuals through our refugee policies, through asylum. He's certainly taken a position with childhood arrivals, with DACA, children, that is, children who came to the United States, grew up in the United States. They came to the United States with their parents, but they frankly they may have entered illegally or overstayed. These have been kind of the central focus of his platform, but it does spill out into immigration provisions for high-skilled workers, for your scholars, your students. So we want to talk a little bit about that. There's certainly a desire to modernize our immigration system, and we're going to see at least some of the contours of that in a forthcoming slide with where the Biden administration, pretty soon after entering office, introduced a very, very comprehensive bill called, which I'll refer to as the Biden bill, trying to modernize our immigration system. And we're going to be focusing in that bill on some provisions and revisions that affect international student scholars and high-skilled workers. Next slide, please. So before doing that, because one of the recurrent questions is, when are we going to see all these changes taking place? Or why can't Biden put the pedal to the metal? Why can't we just speed up the reconstitution of our immigration system? And that really gets into a primer on U.S. civics. And I just want to, one of the reasons it has become so pronounced is because in the last administration, so much was done under executive order. But when you take a look at the US system, there's a hierarchy in how things can change legally. You obviously have the Constitution, and under that, you have statutes. That would be laws passed by the Congress, signed by the president, which carries significant impact, significant force in terms of creating US laws and policies. Under that, if the statute creates certain parameters of action, then the agencies, the different implementing agencies, need to develop regulations, which is actually a process in which the agency needs to draft rules. They need to go through notice. They have to solicit and receive and analyze comments from the public, and then come out with the final rules. So if something can be done or needs to be done through agency regulation, that is still a fairly lengthy and complex process. But then below that, there are certainly actions that are unaddressed within the statute or agency regulation, and which could be dealt with under either executive order, so declaration by the president, or by agency directives, not having to go through rulemaking. And the line in terms of what the president is allowed to do through executive order is oftentimes somewhat cloudy. So oftentimes there's an overstep. And what happens? The courts would intervene And basically the courts are entrusted with keeping this whole system in balance and functioning smoothly. But my only point, and the point that has to be really understood, is that changes can oftentimes do not occur overnight, but rather have to go through, fall into one of these baskets, and which basket it falls into will determine the timeline and the process for effectuating change. Next slide, please. So what happens? Biden is inaugurated January 20th, and less than a month later, he introduces a pretty comprehensive immigration reform bill. So what it does is it addresses a great many inadequacies in the US immigration system. What I want to do is really focus on the provisions that affect you and your community. That is, thought leaders, high-skilled workers, the university community. One of the, and so what it does is it says, look, within the employment-based system, we have these horrific backlogs. The most egregious one probably being the backlog for professionals from India, where because no country can, because each country is limited to a limit of 7% of the total number of green cards because of the large population and well-educated population of India, this per country cap limit has created such horrific backlogs that the immigration system is kind of not ground to a halt, but it just is not functioning quite efficiently. So there are a number of provisions that would make available new immigrant visas for employment-based cases. And the whole idea is to reduce the time required between initiating a case and when someone gets a green card, and not to hold people in limbo and employers in limbo for such a long period of time. So the bill does not actually increase the number of green cards, but what it does is it has provisions to reallocate the distribution of green cards within the system and to allocate more green cards to the employment-based system. There are provisions to reduce wait times, not to have people waiting for certain basic benefits under immigration law, like employment cards or the processing of various types of applications. One of the big things is that it does overtly eliminate the per country visa caps. It eliminates this 7%, which would mean in the current architecture of immigration law that the backlog for India would be reduced significantly, but there would be backlogs imposed probably on nationals from all other countries. So it's kind of meeting in the middle, and it's not a, in our estimation, it is not a total solution, but it is at least a step in the right direction by limiting these per country visa caps. There are some provisions and some really interesting provisions for STEM professionals, particularly for PhDs having in the STEM disciplines, creating very, very streamlined, expedited pathways to permanent residence and removing them entirely from the quota system. Next. And obviously that would be of major benefit to your community. A couple of other things it does. It says that spouses of H-1B workers, and not just spouses, but children, can apply for employment cards, which is a situation that exists today but under the Trump administration, there was recurrent threats to remove the employment card accessibility for spouses. And this bill would say no, spouses and dependents really can get employment cards. And that's certainly a very, very welcome initiative leading to family stability. At present, if a parent is going for permanent residence and their cases take a long time, and again, in India, you could have a case dragging on for many, many years. Once a child turns 21 years of age, they lose their ability to gain permanent residence as part of the family unit. That's current law. And what this bill says is, look, if a case is started when a child is under 21, the child's age basically gets frozen. So again, it's an initiative to keep families together. And a final provision, which would really be welcome within your campus, would be to give what's known as dual intent to F1 students and J1 scholars. And what that says is that under current law, in order for a student to get an F1 visa to come to the United States, or a scholar to get a J1 visa to come and do a postdoc, they have to go through a song and dance to establish that they intend to go back to their home country. So they have to have what's known as temporary non-immigrant intent. And what that does is it adds a significant level of uncertainty to their continuing ability to qualify for F and J visas. It stymies their ability to get permanent residence while they're in student or scholar status. And this, by having dual intent, it's a provision. It's in a way a fiction, but it says, look, it's okay for you to have temporary intent for at present to be a student, but to have an ultimate intent to become a permanent resident. So it lets permanent resident cases coexist with F and J cases. Next slide. So the bill was introduced. What's the prognosis for success? Again, it's about the same as winning the Colorado State Lottery, which I didn't look at the statistical probability, but I'm assuming it's pretty low. And why is that? Next slide, please. Right now, as I pretty much see it, any type of initiative to modernize, to streamline, to revise the U.S. immigration system is going to be really dependent on getting the southern border situation under control. That's really a kind of the Achilles heel so far to the Biden administration. How do you live up to humanitarian values when you have thousands of people stuck in Mexico, not being able to present their asylum claims in the United States? How do you honor your humanitarian values when you have children coming into the United States, oftentimes unaccompanied, and yet you still need to exercise discipline and control over the borders? So how do you walk that line? And until that is really resolved, I don't think there's any chance we're going to see comprehensive immigration reform. We may have, and we probably will, by the way, have some incremental measures, but it's not going to be this sweeping revision. Next slide. Nevertheless, there have been a number of measures that have been taken that translate into a more favorable immigration climate. So what are they? First of all, the Buy American, Hire American policy has been abrogated, rescinded. And what that kind of did is it became an umbrella excuse for the immigration examiners to really, pardon the expression, really put the screws to immigration requests. under a claim that they were serving as kind of last-ditch protectors for the American worker. Whereas, just as an editorial comment, H-1B workers, all the studies indicate that they're actually job creators rather than displacing U.S. workers. You have the DACA has been stabilized and protected. So, in other words, the United States will not be deporting childhood arrivals. There's the rescission of the Muslim travel ban, which basically created disproportionately along religious lines an ineligibility to get visas. More closely to employment-based immigration, one of the principles, and Deborah's going to be talking about it, is in many cases, you have to show that in order to sponsor someone for permanent residence or for an H-1B visa, that an employer is paying the normal appropriate wages for the position. And what is the normal appropriate wage, or the prevailing wage, is somewhat of a, it's somewhat of black magic. It is not something that can be precisely determined. You have to rely on certain presumptions, and in the past, the presumption was that wages should be set, we felt, artificially high in order to protect U.S. workers. We feel that there's now a reversion to a more realistic standard. Finally, there's a revocation of something called a public charge rule, which was a kind of a Rube Goldberg requirement that foreign nationals, even ones who really are holding high-paying jobs, had to go through this incredible vetting process to show that they would not go on public benefits. I think it was an 18-page questionnaire with a lot of intrusive requests for information and documentation. And while a foreign national gaining permanent residence still cannot get public benefits, welfare, that's a little bit overstated, but that's basically the law. The means to show that they won't require welfare payments is being changed or basically returned to a standard that was used for many years. So that's what's been created so far. Next slide, please. What has not, I'm sorry. A couple other things. The H-4 EAD I told you about, that is now firmly set that they're going to allow spouses and family members to have employment cards. Something very much at issue on your campus was there was a previous proposal that would subject your F students and J scholars to severe penalties if they were to overstay. It was really a big thing. And your own campus filed a very well thought out and comprehensive comment objecting to it, as did something like 25,000 other institutions and individuals. And so that's been withdrawn. Under the Trump administration, there was a special unit that was kind of policing very rigorously and intrusively whether an F1 student was complying with optional practical training, which is a program giving students the ability to get some real world experience in the employment force. That's been rescinded. ISSS still has responsibilities to ensure compliance. It's just it's been taken out of the federal unit. There was significant restrictions on the ability of foreign nationals to get green cards and H visas mainly through consulates abroad. Again, that has been rescinded. And there was also a retraction of the eligibility of foreign nationals to get H-1B visas based on employment in many computer professionals. And again, that was an initiative under Trump that has also been rescinded. So it expands H-1B eligibility. There's also been some liberalizations in the ability of foreign nationals to get citizenship through the naturalization process. And Deborah's also going to be talking about the H-1B lottery process, which is a process through which your students and scholars on leaving the university community needing H-1Bs may very well become subject to the H-1B quota caps, the quota. Next slide. But what's not changed is the basic architecture to our system. How many green cards, how many H-1B visas there are in the system. We're still, and very, very regrettably, we're still seeing at the working level a culture of no. Again, Deborah's going to be talking a little bit more about that, but a broad range of cases that your students and scholars pursue require immigration examiners to make a kind of a gut call, exercise discretion. Is someone really an outstanding research figure, or is someone really contributing to the United States? And there's developed kind of a culture of no, we're not going to exercise discretion in these cases. We've not yet seen fully that a new culture take root within the immigration system. There's still massive instabilities in international travel. And Deborah's going to be talking about that. She's also going to be talking about delays in the system and backlogs. So are we on the right track? I mean, there have been some good things which have happened, but there's still a long, long way to go. So to put it more in perspective and to link kind of these large scale developments to the experiences of your own community, I'm going to turn the program over to Deborah.
Thank you, Bob. So I was told previously before we started that our last talk left everyone a bit depressed. So we hope what Bob had just described gives you a little bit more positive feelings about where immigration may go, but also a bit of a reality check of what we're still working through today. I'm going to talk briefly initially on just providing kind of an immigration basic, what I call a 101, just to give you some feedback into the types of applications that you'll likely as a department be filing and sponsoring for your current employees, or what your students are going to be interested in. The two main categories people pursue work authorization is through the H-1B program or in attaining permanent residence. So the H-1B program is for what we call specialty occupations. So the minimum requirement for someone to secure an H-1B is to have at least a bachelor's degree or a foreign equivalent or the equivalent in work experience and be working in an occupation that as a minimum entry requires such a degree. Once you've met that initial threshold, then you need to take a look at whether you've established the payment of prevailing wage, as Bob had mentioned before. And universities have their own wage scale that they have to look at. And the ISSS team always does a really nice wage memo to assess what the wage range is for the occupation that the university sponsors. But what had come up last year and is still temporarily on hold but could come back is an increase in what the base level of prevailing wages are. Even within the Biden bill, they left open the ability to raise this base threshold. If that should happen, it would greatly curtail the use of the H-1B program, because essentially it's going to cost employers more to invest in foreign labor than it would be today, where they're paid the same wage rate as US workers. And so right now it's still on hold through May 14th, and it's something that we're watching as the comment period reopens to see what will happen. So once you've established that the individual qualifies based on their education, the occupation qualifies, and you can pay the wages, you can go ahead with an H-1B petition for the individual. But if the university is what we call a cap exempt employer. This means you can file an H-1B for your employee at any time. You don't have to enter what we call the H-1B lottery. So for any private employer, they have to enter an H-1B lottery, which is actually ongoing right now. They have until the 25th at noon to enter this lottery, where Congress has allocated 65,000 visas for the entire country, an additional 20,000 visas for those who have U.S. master's degree or higher. That's it for the whole nation. And you can only apply during this 2.5-week window. And it's a random lottery that's run by computers. And essentially on April 1st, we should find out who gets accepted. And if you're accepted, then you can actually file a petition and sponsor the individual. One of the proposals that had come up under the last administration was to make the H-1B lottery based upon the income level being paid the individual. So in your prevailing wage, there's normally a 4-tier classification for entry level versus higher level individuals. And they would, instead of having it be a completely random lottery, it'd be based on the level wages paid. So someone who's paid at a level 4 wage with lots of experience is going to make it in, where new graduates as the entry level would have a very difficult time getting into the H-1B lottery. So this is something we're still watching and hope that it does not happen, because it's going to really cause much more consternation for individuals, recent graduates trying to find jobs in the labor market. But it shouldn't have a huge impact on universities, because fortunately you're still exempt. So this lottery is not something you have to worry about so far. And so as we discussed, universities, you're cap exempt. Also your nonprofit affiliates. So this often can be, so potentially hospitals that are associated with the university. Also who may be exempt are individuals who work for the university plus a private employer at the same time. They can be considered cap exempt. Government research organizations, and your foreign physicians. So individuals who you sponsor for Conrad waivers, for example, are going to be exempt from the quota, or individuals who've already been entered into the lottery. So an individual who's been successful in getting into the lottery and already working in H-1B status can transfer employment for another employer, and they're not counted again into the cap. So once you're in the cap, you should be good for during that 6-year period of time, and extensions thereafter as needed. And another category is called employed at. So say if you had an individual who's working for a private employer, but they're going to be based at your institution, they're actually going to be working at the university, but not paid by the university, they may be able to file an exemption from the H-1B lottery by virtue of being at the university, provided we can show that includes a benefit to the purpose of being at the institution. So as I just explained, those are the key benefits. It's a value for the university, and it isn't something that's likely to go away. It was codified in the regulations that came out in 2017. So we feel very secure and solid that you'll be able to continue filing these well into the future. Again, the best part about it, being exempt, is you avoid this lottery system. You avoid the worry of having to file your submissions in a certain period of time, and you don't have any timing issues or delays. You don't have to worry about something falling out of status, or they're potentially being able to stay here but not being able to work depending on when their OPT ended. So the next step to look at, and actually before I go into employment base, I will make one comment going back into the H-1B program. And this is really regarding your scholars who are working in J1. And I raise this because this is a bit of an area that the ISS office and I work with a lot, and we're seeing more and more of. So in terms of the delays that Bob mentioned 3 times, delay, one area we're seeing great delays in is in getting waivers of the 2-year requirement. So many of your J1 scholars may have triggered a 2-year home residence requirement. And this could have been based on funding for their program. This could be based on a skills list to their home country. But if the J1 is subject to a 2-year requirement, it prevents the university from filing an H-1B on their behalf until that is waived. And what we're finding out is individuals may have started the waiver process, but what used to take only 3 to 4 months is taking upwards of 6 to 8 months. And so if the waiver process is not started soon enough, many of your scholars are finding themselves falling out of status. And because of travel restrictions and fears of COVID and embassy closures, it's making it much more difficult for them to wait for it to happen because they can't go home to their home country. So one of our suggestions is for any scholars on J1s that you think you may have a possibility of wanting to file an H-1B is to look at this 212E issue at the very beginning and encourage them to file for their waivers as soon as possible, because there's very little, unfortunately, that can be done to help expedite this, as we're seeing, and it will make a much more smoother transition to go from J1 to H-1B. So on to employment-based options. So what many individuals who've been here potentially as F1 students for 6 or 7 years or getting their PhD or the programs, they've already established their life in the US. And this is where they'd like to build their career and their home and their future. And so they're looking at ways to get a green card. That green card provides them with really security to be able to be in the US with less chance of the risk of being asked to leave, right? Whether they lose most otherwise their employment, their ability to remain in the US is completely contingent upon their employment or maintaining their student status. So ways to get a green card, I'm going to be talking about ways a university could be proactive in assisting. A few options is for the employer as a university to sponsor the foreign national. The two primary programs are through the PERM or labor certification process, which is where the university runs a test of the labor market to see if there's qualified US citizen or permanent resident workers to fill the position. If through a series of recruitment as outlined in the regulations, no qualified US workers apply or are qualified for the position, the university can be certified by the Department of Labor to sponsor for a national long-term. And once it's received its certification, it could then file an immigrant visa petition for the individual to establish that the individual qualifies for the position and the university can afford to pay the wages offered. Then the individual can file to adjust status and maintain a green card. Another possibility is for those who are really, we're looking at primarily PhD, sometimes masters, but individuals who are in the tenure track position or individuals who have research proposals to make for longer term employment, if we can show that they are outstanding at what they've done, they're advancing the field to a significant degree, this area that Bob had mentioned regarding discretion, by establishing, for example, detailed publications, original research, really a track record showing establishment, they can themselves get a green card. So, but if the university is unable to sponsor an individual or they don't meet those criteria, the individual themselves can also apply in two categories for their own green card. One, the EB1 of extraordinary ability is the highest level, meaning it's the most difficult to attain, which requires really someone to establish their extraordinary, whether this be in arts, in science, in business, in sports. They have to show that they're the creme de la creme, right? They're the best at what they do. Another option is to establish that the individuals working in the US national interests, to show that through their accomplishments to date and the accomplishments in the future, they're going to advance the US national interest in a particular field. For example, someone who engaged in original cancer research, right? And they've developed a new process for determining malignancies. They may show that their continued work in this area is going to benefit US healthcare. And so this may be a possibility and a path to pursue. How you decide what's the proper path is going to be very individual to the applicant. So things that are going to look at are what's the quota for their backlog? Are they from India or China, which has a much longer wait than say someone from Canada or from Mexico? So where are they born? Because even though they may have dual citizenship, it's the country of birth that determines their place in the immigration line. How long will it take? The EB1 category can be premium process, meaning you can get a decision in just a few weeks versus the national interest waiver could take 7 to 10 months. It also could depend on the discretion. Is it a borderline case? Do they have a really interesting profile, but their metrics, what I call it, are kind of weak? Not many people have cited their work. Or they have a bunch of papers, but they're not yet published, right? This may be a case where the PERM may be a better process for them because you know they have a unique skill set that's hard to find in the market. Maybe the PERM is the better option. Do they have the support of the department? A PERM process must be paid by the university. You can't shift the cost to the individual, where other applications the individual can pay themselves. An outstanding researcher, for example, can only be sponsored by the university. It's not a self-petition. So these are things we'd want to discuss. There's also, and we're happy to send a link to, for individuals, Bob has written a beautiful piece called 10 Keys to Attaining Permanent Residence for Postdoc Scholars, which really can be applicable to others outside of postdoc, but really providing a nice detailed explanation as to these programs that I've just mentioned and which may be the best path to pursue. And then the strengths and metrics. So as you may know, Bob and I will often vet and speak with many of your individuals to see what's the best path. Some individuals may feel they're fantastic and so highly accomplished, and we may have to bring them back to reality to say, while we agree right now, we're seeing, pushback by the agency. We may see discretion being used against institutions, and it may be wise to pursue a different path at this time and circle back to look at maybe in a couple years, you're actually going to meet that higher threshold category. And now I'll bring us to one of the headaches for all of us is international travel. One of my favorite things in the world is to go to new countries. So having been trapped in my basement for over a year has been painful. But for many individuals, they have to travel, whether it be for business or family reasons, or to maintain their status in the US. And what we've seen over the last year and a half has been a current and rotating and continuing shock between our country and other countries as to closures, restrictions, and travel, really for the most part, because of COVID. So I'll walk through a few things of what we saw. So the first thing we saw, and I'm ignoring the previous administration travel bans because fortunately they've been lifted. But right now we do have travel bans in place primarily because of COVID. And the first one I'll talk about is, I call them geographic bans because they're really based on your country of where you're coming through. So the first one, and I'm embarrassed because I realize I don't have China listed, but the first ban that actually came into being was China, right? Right after COVID came announced, a ban was in place for China. Soon after came essentially most of Europe, right? Schengen area. Following that was the UK and Ireland, because they didn't want to forget they're not part of the Schengen area, but equally had high rates. Then we had variants, right? It happened in Brazil, it happened in South Africa, bam, travel restrictions were put in place. And so these are not based on individual status, and it's for really for COVID. That's what it primarily is. Now with that, they have included some exemptions, right? So the key is to know if you're going to be traveling from one of these countries. And I say from because you could have a layover for 1 hour in Paris and boom, you've now triggered that. I had individuals who went to Croatia because they're not part of Schengen. They thought, fantastic, I'll travel from Croatia, I'll come to the US, but they had to fly from Croatia to London to the US. And when they got to London, London said, we're not allowing you to travel. These are being imposed also by the airlines. And so you have to take under consideration where your employees are traveling to. So there are exemptions. So individuals who have citizen spouses, a permanent resident, who have children and family members are going to be exempt from these. And I'll go into a little bit more detail. So first, look at where they're traveling from. We also have border restrictions. So land border between Canada and Mexico has been imposed. You're not going to be able to go fishing in Canada. You're not going to be able to go to the beaches of Mexico if you're traveling by land. Airlines are open, so you can fly in to those countries, but you cannot travel by land unless you qualify for their exemptions. There's also visa suspension. So this is the one that is based on categories for individuals who are not physically in the US in June 2020. And I'm going to miss the date, so I'm not going to quote it off the top of my head, but they are still exempt until the end of this month from getting new HL or J visas. Now, it's set to expire on March 31st. We do not know if this will be extended. We are optimistic that it will also be let go, but it could be reimposed. And so this is something that you have to be aware of for those who would need to get new visas who were overseas at the time. If you were physically in the US at that time, you can still get a new visa. So these are things to be aware of. There are exemptions. And there's also exemptions for healthcare professionals, exemptions again, for those with US relatives. So we can walk through on a case-by-case basis if you're exempt from this. But are we also finding that the consulates in general, really most consulates reopened after August of last year, with more so opening in October. But certain countries like Nepal, for example, they're still closed. There's almost no visa appointments. So before anyone is traveling, and if they need to get a visa stamp, we first have to look at what are the processing times. We're seeing individuals apply for visas, and the soonest they're getting in is September of 2021, right? Not ideal. So can we qualify for an emergency or an expedited appointment? And in many cases, we're able to do so, but it's, again, a case-by-case basis. So all of these factors need to be thought before someone leaves the country. And what also happens is, be aware that even if you get a visa appointment, we're seeing the embassies just routinely reschedule them, right? They may cancel the appointment and push it out a few months because maybe the numbers went too high and the embassy personnel aren't coming in. These are all factors that everyone has to take into consideration when traveling. So needing these national interest exemptions. So what this means is individuals still need to travel. And so most of these exemptions I'm referring to are coming from those who have geographic bands, right? And so there are exemptions. Again, the family ties are key. If you're married to a US citizen, your parent's a US citizen, if your spouse is a permanent resident, you have children under 21, siblings under 21, or the parent of those units, you're going to be able to be exempt. And we actually tell people to travel with their marriage certificate or their children's birth certificate to show proof they qualify for this exemption, both to get in the airline and be able to enter the US. There are exemptions if you work in public health, and it's not limited to only COVID. It has been expanded for those who work in other areas of healthcare that are integral in fighting the pandemic. And we've been very successful in establishing that most healthcare occupations are providing such a benefit. If you work for government organizations, they've been able to get exemptions in certain circumstances. They've narrowed down the ongoing employment to really critical infrastructure, right? So what industries do you work for? So healthcare, again, would do so, but not all areas. So we want to look at, do you provide IT support? Is it transportation? You know, how can we fit you into things that are valued to the US? One good thing we have seen is they have done essentially almost a blanket approval for F1 and J1 scholars. So they used to have to request a formal approval from the embassy before they could come in. And the new exemptions are pretty much saying, we know you're exempt, we're going to be able to get you a visa and you're going to be able to enter. So those are key factors. Things that have become more difficult would be individuals who are just coming in on an H-1B if they're not in one of those critical infrastructure or health areas. Multinational managers for businesses, they're getting denied, and we hadn't seen that before. So again, a lot of this is really just dependent on the COVID numbers, on the embassy, and getting these requests in. Again, I mentioned the international student exemption, which is huge and widely important for your individual studying there. But things to also keep in mind, as it's very country specific who has quarantine requirements. So while it may be fine that we'll say you'll be able to get your visa and go abroad, don't forget that country may have their own rules. So they may require a quarantine. They're going to require a COVID test before you can go in. And many countries require you to first be quarantined for 14 days before you go to your visa appointment. And in fact, we have that similar in the United States, where all travelers, regardless of citizenship or visas, have to have a negative COVID test within 72 hours before boarding their flight to the US. And to attend immigration interviews here on naturalization, if you've come in from outside the country, they're going to require you to first be here for 14 days before you go to an interview. So these are all factors we all have to consider. So anyone who has international travel, we highly recommend you take a look at the embassy webpage before you go, check the CDC page on travel, and call an attorney if you have questions before you go. It's changing frequently. So in conclusion, we want to be open for questions, and I think Bob may have a few final parting words as well.
Very few parting words, other than to note, you know, I mean, it's hard to really kind of figure out or draw a unitary conclusion as to what's going on. Again, we're early in the term. I think there's a lot of goodwill. I think there's a growing realization, frankly, that some significant changes need to be made in our immigration system, in particular in employment-based immigration. And in particular for, things like healthcare workers and frontline workers and so on. And just, to keep the United States competitive. And certainly we've seen a stark drop-off in admission rates for international students and scholars, largely due to immigration. And yet this is the feeder source for US global competitiveness. So I do think that there are some legitimate seeds, some legitimate grounds to think that over the next period of time, we will be seeing some liberalizations and modernizations in our program, but it's going to take some time. And again, my own call is that it's also going to require some type of conclusion of the southern border situation. But we've thrown, I think, just a huge amount of concepts and thoughts and information, which we hope you found useful, but we would be very receptive to questions and comments by anyone. So thank you very much. So, Amy, I don't think you've gotten anything in the chat, correct?
No, we don't. It doesn't appear that we have anything. If anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, that would be great.
Can we then just take 2 minutes and, and maybe this is for, Deborah as well as for Amy and Lana as well, which is, Deborah walked us through international travel issues. And again, they're ever changing. They really are. But I have to believe that you get recurrent questions from your foreign nationals. Can I travel? Perfectly legitimate question. What's your general policy, and how do you advise? What are you telling people? And I don't know, Deborah, if you want to go first, or if Amy or Lana want to.
Well, I can just speak that I know Amy will set up meetings with any student who has travel questions, and in fact, for scholars wants them to definitely contact their office before making any appointments. And again, these are questions we get every day, all day, and we have to really do an analysis. What country are they from? What do they need a visa? If so, what's going on at the embassy? Are they subject to any of the bans? Do they have any qualifying exemptions? Can we make an emergency appointment? If so, how does that, can we communicate that? What are the embassy requirements? How long are they taking to get back? And it's, and then even from there, what countries are they going through to get there? What countries are they going to take to come home? There's a lot of factors that all come into play before someone can travel. I don't know, Amy, if you do something on your calls as well.
I mean, that's pretty much exactly how it goes. I mean, it's kind of an assessment of the full situation for the employee. I think also I'm really clear with them that, if they get stuck outside the United States, they're going to have to be in close contact with their supervisor, with their department, with us, making sure that we're aware of what's going on. We've also had some conversations with people about what it would look like if they had to work remotely from outside the US, and what the policy is at the institution on that. I mean, it's a very complicated issue, and we've been working with our international tax office, with central HR on whether we need to have some kind of workplace agreement, you know, and we've also been, as an institution and CU system, looking into the employer-employee relationship from abroad and what that looks like. So it's, you know, it's very, very complicated. And I think for some employees, the conversation has been, you know, are you able to wait? Or, you know, do you have to go right now? Is, you know, what is going on? Will this impact your employment if you get stuck abroad? And unfortunately, sometimes the conversations are, you know, it's such a serious situation. People are so concerned for their families that they're willing to quit their job if they have to go home and to be with their family. I mean, you know, it's kind of dire circumstances these days. Alana, would you add anything else to that in your conversations?
I would say that we're just trying to make sure that we kind of go through a checklist with every person that we're speaking to make sure that they're taking all of these different things into consideration that might affect their ability to come back on time, and that they're kind of have a plan in place prior to leaving the United States, rather than trying to figure it out on the spot when they get to their home country. And I also see that there is a question in our chat about a J1 coming from Brazil in a postdoc position starting on June 1st. And we could definitely try to process this request and try to see if this person will be able to get here by the beginning of June. However, from what we've seen recently, based on couple of scholars that we were trying to bring in from Brazil, if they do not qualify for the national interest exemption, the visa appointment will be at the end of September as of this time. So we would need to kind of look at all of the possible ways that we can get an exemption for this scholar if he would like to start on June 1st. Just because the wait time for an appointment in Brazil right now are very long, just like Deborah mentioned at end of September.
Yeah, and I don't see the travel restriction with Brazil lifting necessarily anytime soon. The situation there is pretty serious with COVID.
If I can just go back to the general question of, you know, someone asked, can I travel internationally? I think that the information from Deborah, Amy, and Lana is really, really good. I would just add two things. First of all, and I think Lana suggested as well, before leaving, or actually even before entering your own office, I really think your postdocs in particular, your scholars, need to sit down with their PIs and really talk through what happens if I get delayed and what does that do. So it's not just the, you know, the PI has to have an awareness that the foreign national may be indisposed for some period of time. And again, it's just it just has to be factored in. The second thing, and again, this is my own practice, but I think it's endorsed by everyone else, is you know, the general, you know, my general response is to, you know, if possible, to postpone, you know, this is just not a stable time. But at the same time, you know, I can't make decisions on what it means to see family, or, you know, for that matter, to go to a wedding. I mean, you know, to your brother's wedding. You know, I mean, these are really personal, you know, life sustaining purposes. So I think you have to respect that and really work around it. Again, it's while the general tenor is don't travel unless absolutely necessary, I think you have to respect someone who says, you know what, I appreciate what you're saying, but I just have to go. So, and those are tough conversations. Okay, I think we're at the hour, and again, we very much appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. We hope it's been illuminating, and you have such a wonderful team in place in ISSS. You're very fortunate, and to the extent we can supplement their efforts, we'd be very honored to do so. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob and Deborah. We really appreciate it.
You're
And thanks
welcome.
everyone for joining us. Just let us know if you have any questions, and we're here to help. Have a good day.